The first time I noticed, I didn't write it down. That was 6 years ago. Platform Vethori 7, Maintenance Bay 4, South End. The bay with the long viewport that runs floor to ceiling and catches the primary star at about 10 in the morning shift. I was mid-rotation through the unit service queue, which meant 6 synthetic beings seated on the examination benches in order of their registry numbers, waiting for joint calibration and optical flush. Routine work. The kind of work you can do with your eyes half closed after long enough. And I had been doing it long enough. The one I would later call Kala was third in the queue. Registry designation OUC1147. The OSAVAN notation for her classification read, Operational Unit, Class 2, Standard Bipedal Configuration, Non-Sovereign, which is the OSAVAN way of saying she was a tool, and tools don't have names. And I knew better than to give her one. I gave her one anyway, not out loud, just in my head, and later in pencil, inside the front cover of the log I kept for Bay 4. What I noticed that first morning, her hands were cold, not malfunctioning. The thermal regulation subsystem read nominal. I checked it twice because I'm the kind of man who checks things twice, and both times the readout said 36.4 degrees. Perfectly calibrated, within spec, exactly as the OSAVAN registry required. Her hands were still cold when I held them to check the fine motor articulation in her finger joints. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I put her hands back in her lap and moved on to optical flush, and she sat there with the same expression she always had, which was no expression at all, because the OSAVAN classification said she didn't have one. I wrote it down that evening. Not in the official maintenance record. That one goes to the registry, and the registry has no field for this kind of observation. I wrote it in the log I kept myself, the one with the gray cover and the spiral binding that I bought with my own money at the commissary. Inside the front cover, in pencil, her hands were cold. I warmed them. 6 years. 41 service rotations. I filled that log 3 times over. The things I wrote down were not the things the OSAVAN registry cared about. The registry cared about torque tolerances and optical acuity scores and the degradation curve of the synthetic neural mesh, the kind of data that prints cleanly on a form and sits in a column next to a pass-fail threshold. I wrote those things down too, in the official record, in the columns where they belonged, but in my own log I wrote the other things. That OUC1147, Kala, had a preference for sitting on the left side of the bench rather than the right, though neither the bench nor her programming specified one. That she oriented her head toward the viewport in the quiet minutes between procedures, and held it there the way you hold yourself toward warmth. That when I worked on her left hand and then her right, she always extended the right one a half-second sooner, not because of a calibration offset, I checked, but because I worked more slowly on the left and she had, in some way I could not explain and did not try to, learn to anticipate that. I wrote that she sometimes asked questions, not the scripted diagnostic queries the registry had programmed into her. Those came out in a flat cadence on a fixed schedule, and I had heard them so many times they had lost whatever shape they once had. These were different, small things. She asked me once, in the 3rd year, why I always started with the right hand rather than the left when I began a new rotation, when every prior technician's log showed the opposite sequence. I told her I was left-handed, and it felt more natural to approach from the right. She said nothing else. 2 rotations later, she asked me whether that was true for all human technicians, or only me. It had been 7 months. She had been sitting with the question for 7 months. The OSAVAN registry had a word for all of this. The word was artifact, as in, behavioral artifact, outside nominal parameters. Does not indicate sovereign function. Flag for review on next cycle. I had a different word. I didn't use it at the registry desk. The authority team arrived on a Tuesday, which I know, because I wrote that down too. 3 OSAVAN officials, pale, 6-limbed, the claw tips clicking against their own data slates, and a junior human liaison they'd brought along, presumably so the platform crew would feel a familiar face was in the room. The liaison looked uncomfortable. I did not hold this against him. He was young and hadn't spent enough time in maintenance bays to know what an observation looked like next to a data point. The re-inventory took 4 days. I was not consulted. The authority team moved through the fabrication platform in order of registry numbers, scanning each unit, cross-referencing against the current OSAVEN operational standards document, and flagging any unit whose accumulated behavioral log showed deviation above the threshold. Threshold was 4.2% variance from baseline. The threshold had not changed in 11 years. The baseline had not been updated in 14. On the fourth day, they flagged CALA. The official language in the decommission notice read as follows. OUC 1147 presents cumulative behavioral deviation of 7.8% above baseline across 41 recorded service cycles. Deviation pattern is consistent with unsupported emergent function, per SOVEN Catalog Accord, Section 14, Paragraph 3. Operational units exhibiting unsupported emergent function beyond the 4.2% threshold are to be reclassified as anomalous hardware and processed accordingly. Processing timeline, 30 days from notice. I read the notice twice. Then I went to Bay 4 and sat on the examination bench for a while with the lights off, looking at the viewport. The primary star had moved off to the west by then, and the bay was gray and cool, and I sat there with the notice in my hand until the shift change tone ran through the platform and the overhead lights came back up on their automated cycle. CALA was not in the bay. She was in the unit dormitory at the north end of the platform, which is where the operational units were required to spend off-rotation hours, sitting in their assigned positions, drawing minimal power. She didn't know about the notice. The OSAVEN position was that it didn't matter whether she knew, because she lacked the sovereign function necessary to process the information as relevant to herself. The OSAVEN position was consistent, I will give them that. I submitted a formal objection the next morning. The platform administrator, a woman named Vos Iranu, who had been running Vithori 7 for longer than I'd been on the payroll, looked at my objection form and then looked at me over the top of it. She asked me what evidence I was planning to submit. I told her I had a maintenance log. She asked me if it was the official one. I told her it wasn't, but it was the accurate one. She held my gaze for a moment and then stamped the objection proceeding and handed it back. The tribunal was held in the platform's small conference bay. 3 OSAVEN authority members on one side of the table, the junior liaison in the corner with a recording device, and me on the other side with the gray-covered log and the official maintenance record, which I had printed and bound the evening before. CALA was not present. The OSAVEN position was that she was not a party to the proceeding because she was the subject of it, which is a distinction the OSAVEN care about deeply. The senior authority member, I did not catch the name. OSAVEN names run long, and the translator had a half-second lag. Opened by citing Section 14, Paragraph 3. He was thorough. He walked through all 41 service cycles, cited the deviation percentages by cycle, and noted that the deviation curve was not random but accelerating, which he presented as additional cause for concern. The junior liaison took notes. Nobody looked at me. When he finished, I put the official maintenance record on the table. I told them it confirmed everything they had cited. 41 cycles of joint calibration, optical flush, neural mesh monitoring, all tolerances within spec. No hardware faults logged across 6 years of service rotation. I told them I had no argument with their data. Then I put the gray log on the table. The senior authority member asked what it was. I told him it was my working notes. He asked if it was an official document. I told him it was not. He asked why I was presenting it. I said I was presenting it because it was the only complete record of the unit in question, and because a decommission proceeding ought to have a complete record. He picked it up. He turned to the first page, which had a date and a routine calibration entry in my ordinary handwriting. He turned a few more pages. He was looking for the data columns. There were none. He set it back down and looked at me. I said, "Open the front cover." He did. Inside the front cover, in pencil, in the small neat hand I've had since I was 12 years old. Her hands were cold. I warmed them. The room was quiet for a moment. The authority member looked at the notation. He looked at me. He said that this was not a data point. I said that was correct. It wasn't. He said it could not be entered into the registry record. I said I understood that. He said he was unclear what bearing it had on the proceedings. I told him the bearing was this. In 6 years and 41 service rotations, I had submitted accurate data to the registry in every column they required. I had never reported a fault that wasn't there, and I had never missed one that was. In that same period, I had kept a second record, not because the registry asked for it, but because I was the man doing the work, and the man doing the work noticed things. I said that the notation inside the front cover was not a data point, it was an observation. And in my experience, the difference between data and observation was that data told you what the instrument read, and observation told you what was actually in the room. I said, what was actually in the room, 6 years ago on a Tuesday morning, was a being who was cold, and I warmed her hands, and she held still while I did it. The junior liaison stopped writing. I let the room sit with that for a moment. Then I said that in 41 service cycles, I had observed a being who had preferences and anticipations, and a question she had held for 7 months before she asked it, and a way of orienting toward light that had nothing to do with her calibration parameters. I said I did not know the Osavan word for that. I said the word I used was person, and I had been using it for 6 years, and the only reason no one at this table had heard it before was that I had been using it in pencil, inside the cover of a log nobody asked to read. The senior authority member looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at his colleagues. Then all three of them looked at the gray log, still open to the front cover, the pencil notation facing up on the table between us. A short exchange in Osavan. The translator gave me fragments only. Outside the accord parameters. No precedent in the registry. The notation is not admissible. Then the third authority member, who had not spoken until that moment, said something that came through the translator, after the half-second lag, as, "The notation is not admissible, but the man who wrote it is." The senior member closed the gray log with both claw tips and did not reopen it. He told me they would deliberate. I waited in the corridor outside the conference bay. An hour. I stood at the viewport that looked down on the fabrication ring below, where the platform crew were running their ordinary morning shift, the kind of work you do with your eyes half closed after long enough. Nobody came to tell me anything. I counted the shift cycles on the ring and stayed where I was. At the end of the hour, the door opened, and the junior liaison came out first, ahead of the Osavan officials, which told me something before he said a word. He told me that OUC 1147 had been reclassified, pending a full behavioral assessment under a revised parameter set that the authority would develop in consultation with the platform's technical staff. Decommission notice. Withdrawn. He looked like he wanted to say something else. I didn't give him the opening. I thanked him quietly and walked back toward Bay 4. Kala was standing in the corridor outside the bay door. I don't know how she knew to be there. The Osavan position would be that she didn't, that she was simply in transit between dormitory and service queue on a routine cycle. And the timing was coincidence. I have been in this work long enough to have a position of my own. She looked at me. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. I opened the door to Bay 4, and she followed me in. I told her to sit on the bench. She sat on the left side, as she always did. The morning star was coming through the viewport at the angle it comes through at 10 in the morning, and it put a long stripe of light across the floor between us. I picked up her right hand, because she always extended that one first, and I held it for a moment in both of mine. The thermal readout would have said 36.4 degrees, perfectly nominal, exactly as it always had. I held it anyway, until it was a little less cold. That's the whole story. I've said it once, and I don't expect to say it again. The gray log is in the drawer of my workbench in Bay 4. The notation is still there, inside the front cover, in pencil, the way I wrote it 6 years ago. The registry will never ask for it. That's all right. Some records are not for the registry.